Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to just welcome everybody that is listening in today and watching the webinar. We're very fortunate to have our guest speaker, Anne Bernstein. And Anne has done a tremendous lot of work on research on development and economic growth. And at this stage, with COVID being a very relevant factor in South Africa and having severe consequences for our economy, and will shed some light on what does the future hold for the South African economy and what can be done, what are the plans. Now, just to tell you a little bit more about Anne, Anne is the founder and executive director of the Center for Development and Enterprise. And if you have watched the media, you would have seen a lot of her commentary on the whole idea of economic growth and what to do to revive the economic structures of South Africa. She has been in many very important positions, and also in the transition team for South Africa. She has been on the board of directors of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. She also did some work for the World Economic Forum, and we are really waiting and we are excited to hear, Anne, what you can share with us for a positive perspective for the South African economy, if there are plans to actually revive the economy. Over to Anne. What we will have is Anne will do a short presentation, and then we will have time for some questions. So you can either put your questions into the chat box, or we will give you time and then you can ask Anne directly after her presentation. Over to you, Anne.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here at UJ and to have the opportunity to talk. I'm going to talk about recovery strategies and the things I think need to be done. And I'll talk for about 25-30 minutes and then we'll have time for discussion. So where are we today? The country has escalating economic, fiscal, and a social crisis, all of which have been exacerbated by poor decision-making and implementation. We have different ministers that approach South Africa's challenges in contradictory ways. The National Treasury wants us to cut spending. The Department of Public Enterprises wants to fund South African Airways. The Department of Social Development wants a basic income grant for every adult. State capacity has been demonstrably weak, and it's riddled with corruption. And we have seen what I think you can only call irrational government decision-making during the lockdown, with some serious consequences for the economy. The most important issue is we have made no significant progress on the reform agenda to help get growth and jobs going again. So you have to ask, where is the country and what are the issues? So I'm going to talk about some key issues relating to growth and economic recovery and reform, and then look at where we are and what we should do. So in July, the end of July, the National Treasury put forward a supplementary budget in order to deal with the COVID crisis. The depth of the cuts they have proposed to public expenditure is, I think, in the view of many respected analysts, not plausible and probably not desirable. The reform program that was first issued late last year has again been deferred to October this year in the medium-term budget statement. And the Treasury is working on a new reform paper with deeper reforms, they tell us. It's important to remember that the Treasury has no power to implement reform unless it has the backing of the President and can get an agreement in Cabinet. So a year after their first reform paper for the economy, not very much has happened, except the lockdown and all the terrible consequences for our economy and for jobs. So in many respects, one sees the National Treasury an impressive department, increasingly isolated and in some respects embattled in government. Now, you sometimes look around and think that the only growth industry in the country is in the production of recovery strategies. So we've seen a plethora of them be developed and be put on the table. I'll deal with the main ones. The ANC document does demonstrate some real movement in terms of policy, but it's very hard to know exactly what this means. You could interpret this document any way you want, a status direction or a more opening up the economy. And in an organization as divided and fractious as the ANC, it's hard to tell what this is exactly. Now, Business for South Africa, representing organized business throughout the country, from the Black Business Council to the Business Leadership South Africa, sort of everybody in organized business, has produced a very substantial contribution on the reforms they think are needed in order to achieve economic growth. This is the long and detailed approach, and I think sometimes the detail overshadows the key messages that they probably want to communicate. There is some overlap between these two documents, but I think it's more in the words than in the substance. Real differences remain. There are essentially two big approaches to how South Africa should think about its economy and recovery. The one, National Treasury and Business for South Africa, is an evidence-based approach with very specific reforms. The other, the ANC and the Alliance, much less specific, mainly the imposition of abstract ideas. Perhaps the most important difference is that the Treasury and business want to enable the economy. They want to enable firms to prosper. The ANC and the Alliance want to discipline capital. The important question is, will these proposals achieve faster and more inclusive growth? Where is government as a whole? Well, last week, the president issued a statement where he said there were 3 processes to support economic recovery. The social partners are working on a social compact, which has just been presented to the president. That's the NEDLAC players who come together to do something. The government will look at that and will then finalize its own economic recovery strategy. And in addition, there will be what he called a presidential employment stimulus, which will commence implementation next month. I'm going to deal with all 3 of these in different ways. So let me start with some of the absolutely key issues that I think are involved if you want to be serious about getting South Africa onto a much faster growth track. And the first is infrastructure. This seems to be the new motherhood. Everybody's in favor of infrastructure, but what does this really mean? I am worried this is going to be the new job summit. Much talk, months of effort, but nothing all that significant happens because everyone avoids the real hard choices. What are some of those? Well, firstly, we have to ask, we've been talking about infrastructure for years and years now. What has stopped private sector involvement in the past? And what must really change to get the massive private sector investment and participation that we need? How exactly should South Africa finance this big infrastructure push? The state has very little money, struggling to cope, and with reduced tax revenue this year, it'll be even harder. So we're going to have to borrow money to deal with this. And it won't only come from domestic sources, but we will be exposed to international risk. We have to make sure then that what we spend that borrowed money on really is important, that we spend it well. And you have to think in the last few years about where we've not done this, Medupi or the trains, and many other examples. So how we spend the infrastructure money really, really matters. And then the last question is, how do we decide which infrastructure priorities have the highest return for the country? Should it be economic or social infrastructure? And if it's economic, what kind of economic infrastructure? So there are a lot of questions here, and the big one is, what is the right way to think about South Africa's infrastructure and maintenance challenge? The second big issue concerns state capacity. Now, the recovery strategies across the board, they all acknowledge state weakness and then proceed to ignore it in the implications for their recommendations. They assume we have a normal, healthy, functioning state. The president himself has said that South Africa needs to build a much more professional and ethical state. But he has not put any practical steps on the table of how he is going to do that. What nobody wants to talk about is, what do we do in the meantime? We don't have an effective state. How do we implement things tomorrow? The truth is that government's policy bandwidth and its strategic capacity has been overwhelmed, the product of enormous weakness in processes, people, and judgment created by ANC misrule over the past 12 years. So, if the state is mainly broken and corrupt, who will implement the reforms and the decisive actions that we need tomorrow and the next day and the next? The third big issue concerns corruption. In my view, corruption is an attack on the poor. It cripples the state, it distorts decision-making, it prevents growth, and it undermines investor confidence. And you have to ask why there's been no significant progress. Now, each of the recovery strategies sort of makes a gesture about, yes, sort of corruption, must deal with corruption. But they don't really engage with how do we do this much more effectively and why we haven't done that so far. And we would argue that speeding up the fight against corruption is absolutely vital and should have been a key pillar of the recovery strategies from all quarters. Now, the fourth big issue, which is hard and uncomfortable and people want to ignore, is what about the fiscal crisis? What do we do? The ratio of debt to GDP has doubled in 10 years, and debt has increased threefold. That means that the costs of servicing South Africa's debt are rising faster than any other item in government's budget. And it's effectively gobbling up a rapidly increasing share of all our tax revenue. That means less for students, less for universities, less for urban infrastructure, less for everything. Now, the ANC and the Business for South Africa recovery strategies do mention corruption, but they do not, they do mention the fiscal crisis, but they don't spell out its implications for the recovery strategy. Many of their recommendations will exacerbate the crisis unless you assume huge and speedy fiscal multipliers. And they generally don't link the fiscal crisis to growth. The size of our fiscal crisis and our debt is dampening growth prospects. On the other hand, without growth, South Africa cannot solve its fiscal situation. So we would argue that fiscal realities must shape recovery recommendations much more than they have. So there are really 6 big interrelated and vital issues. I've talked about infrastructure, state capacity, corruption, the fiscal crisis. Let me say a word about priorities. Now, we can't fix all South Africa's problems at once. We have to pick the right priorities that if we can achieve some momentum and get them done, we can then move on to the next set of priorities. But you have to be ruthless about that. So all the recovery strategy documents sort of move all over the place when it comes to, sorry, can everybody hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can, Anne. We can.
Anne?
Up on my screen. So both Business for South Africa and the ANC wrestle with this issue. The business document ends up with 110 slides, 12 key projects, 12 policy focus areas, and 15 immediate actions, which doesn't quite tell us exactly what must be done immediately. The ANC is sharper in some ways, but as already pointed out, many of the issues hide some of the choices that we have to make rather than illustrate them. So priority seems to us a really important issue that needs to get much more thought. The last point I want to make, which I think is not dealt with well in any recovery strategy so far, is the absolutely vital issue of inclusion. Now, the phrase inclusive economic growth trips off everybody's tongues very easily, but they spend far too little time talking about inclusion. I won't go into detail, we could do that in the discussion, but in our view, we need to include millions and millions more people in our economy. There are costs to the current approach that government is following, and it's time for much more honesty about elite empowerment rather than mass inclusion. If we can get this right, it could result in enormous benefits to the country in many, many different ways. So we would argue that there will be no recovery without proper engagement on each one of these big and difficult issues. Let's turn now to what the president is promising in next month, which is an employment stimulus. We've done a lot of work on South Africa's unemployment situation, and I want to just talk briefly about that. Sadly, South Africa has the world's deepest unemployment crisis. After 2 decades of presidential summits, of government initiatives, of job summits, of NEDLAC debates, of private sector projects, in January this year, we had 10.3 million people unemployed and rising, and it's possible that we're sitting now with about 12 million people unemployed. If you think that's bad, the situation when it comes to youth unemployment can only be described as catastrophic. If you're aged 15 to 34 years, that group of South Africans are 54% unemployed. If you're aged 15 to 24 years, 70% unemployed. The fact is that fewer young people are employed today than in 2010. Just think about that for a moment. And these figures are all pre-COVID. We don't know the exact numbers that have been affected by the lockdown and the economic consequences, but we know it's worse. The problem in our view is that everybody in South Africa wants to avoid and circle around the only real solution. South Africa has to get millions more young people into employment. How do we do that? Well, we've got to change the economy. We've got to get much faster growth, and it has to be much more labor intensive. Secondly, we have to upskill young people for work. It's a disgrace that we have the education system that we do, and that we wallow at the bottom of almost every international comparative table. We spend on the upside of most countries, most middle-income developing countries. Our results are very close to the bottom. This is, in my view, unforgivable. But we also need to look at I'm not an expert on higher education, but we're interested in vocational education and how we get skills to the people who drop out of matric, who just get a matric and can't go on to university. How do we get South Africa's system of skills much, much better? And then we have to connect young people to job opportunity. The wrong approach is to avoid essential reforms and to focus attention, which everybody likes to do, on ad hoc projects or initiatives. These are unable to reach the scale required. They divert energy and focus, and they divert leaders' attention from what really needs to be done. And the result over the last 10 to 15 years is that unemployment has deepened. We would argue for a new approach to the jobs crisis, and that policy reform is absolutely central. We need to change things when it comes to how we run our economy, the rules of the economy, so that we can increase the rate of growth. And then we also need to make this economy much more labor intensive. We have to stop avoiding these essential reforms because nothing else will work at scale. And hard as it is, the truth is, in a developing country like ours, we have to accept that a low-wage job for young, inexperienced people is a better first step than no job at all. So politically difficult decisions have to be taken. The country has to become much more serious about the ever-growing jobs crisis. And government has to change the terms of the debate on growth, on inclusion, and on building a labor-intensive economy. South Africa requires leadership in this area, political will, and astute political management. We think business could do more in that respect as well. So when it comes to growth and employment, very briefly, our proposals for action start with this. Stop fiddling. Stop tweaking on the edges. The big challenge is scale. When you've got millions and millions and millions of people without work and no prospect of work, how do we have impact on scale? That's what counts. We have to adopt a new approach to the jobs crisis. We have to prioritize the reforms necessary for much faster growth. We have to reform the labor market. And in the context of the scale, the reality of scale, and the additional disruptions of the COVID period, we are very much in favor of continuing with the public works jobs and possibly expanding it if we can find the resources. There are things we need to fix, but we should be thinking of large-scale public works jobs. Let me start to move to a conclusion now. The frustrating thing about all of this is that South Africa has the potential to be a great African lion. But somehow we just don't get there. We always disappoint. And now we're in a deep cycle of trouble. Almost everywhere you look, things are getting worse. And this can happen very fast. For South Africa will not make progress if we continue along the same lines. We have to rethink the policies and the attitudes that have brought the country to this very sorry state. And just tweaking old policies will not do the job, as the past 2.5 years have made very clear. The most important issues that need to be rethought relate to the state and the role of markets and the private sector. South Africa's state is weak, corrupt, and ineffective. Doesn't matter what you want, that is the reality. At the same time, South Africa has a strong private sector that could be even more impressive if it were not restrained and held back by policymakers' unjustified belief in the merits of a commandist developmental state. The state can be fixed, and we need an effective state. I'm not a libertarian. I want an effective state. Developing countries need capable states. But it's important to accept that this will take years. Time we do not have at the moment. In every sector of our economy, however, in agriculture, in local government, in land reform, in food distribution or textbook distribution, or wherever you look, we have to free up private actors who in many respects are the only capacity South Africa has today to build a bridge away from disaster. Think of power. You can't grow unless we have electrical power. That's it. And yet somehow we go on and on. We're into about our 13th year of so-called load shedding. But the mines have extra capacity. They could put that extra capacity on the grid. The existing independent power producers could very quickly add additional capacity onto the grid. But we don't free this up. We don't deal with the regulations to make this happen. What's the delay? So there are many other examples, and I'd be happy to talk about them, including land reform, if you were interested. There will be no recovery, in my view, if government's anti-business attitudes and policies persist. This is not a time to expand the role of the state in the economy, which is what the ANC document argues for. I think the government-business relationship has to change. We need a state that seeks to enable business growth, effective, regulated, competitive markets, not a state that sees itself as being responsible for disciplining capital or continually expanding its role in the economy when it can't even do what it already is charged with managing. So let me conclude. In my view, the country needs leadership, bold leadership, not endless processes that never seem to get beyond fiddling or tweaking. And if you put big business, big labor, and big government in a room, these are the incumbents. These are the status quo. They have to find the lowest common denominator of agreement. This is not going to change South Africa. Presidential leadership is absolutely vital, and compacting without bold leadership is not going to produce the results we need. South Africa is, I'm afraid, in serious trouble. And the big question we face is, can the president put national interests above the ANC or the alliance unity? And then, can he build a political coalition to agree on fundamental reforms that we desperately need, and then actually deliver results within the context of a weak state? So let me end by saying that I haven't given up. I think the country can be turned around. And to do that, we need much greater seriousness and honesty about where we actually are, why we're in this terrible situation, and a much more strategic and speedy approach, much more urgency on how we move forward. Thanks very much.
And thank you very much. I am really so appreciative of your honesty, putting things out there and saying it as it is. I think we really do need that. What I would like to do now is open up the floor, and if there are questions, what you can do is just unmute your and see if, and then you can ask the question. You can also use your chat box if you would like to rather ask a question in chat box, and you can put up your hand virtually, and we can address any of your questions.
Is Craig there?
Yes, I am.
Mm-hmm. Please
Hello,
go
Anne.
ahead. Yes.
Hi, this is Craig Charney in New York. One of my thoughts while I was listening to you is that the issue is not just a policy shift, but a cultural shift. I remember some years ago speaking to a graduate seminar at Rhodes University and finding that most of the students, black and white both, thought they lived in a rich country, a developed country, not a developing one. I also remember the extent to which vulgar Marxism ruled the day, and that the notion of profit was sort of a dirty word in the culture. I guess my question is, to what extent do you think that these are cultural problems, that the vision of a strong state may relate to the vision of a developed country, and that the insistence on spanking capital might have to do with the hesitancy to embrace the notion of profit?
Felicia, I think we're going to take a few questions and then I'll respond. So,
okay, let's do that. Let's see if let's take 3 questions and then we will give you an opportunity to respond.
New Leaders Foundation is there?
All right, let's.
Hi, I'm Moses Miller from the New Leaders Foundation. A quick one. As a young person, I guess the question there is, what can I do? What can I do to be part of the solution? I mean, these numbers are staggering. 15 to 24-year-olds are 70% unemployed. That's good. That's a ticking time bomb and a problem that's going to be everyone's problem sooner than what we'd like. So what can I do as a 35-year-old today, tomorrow, and in the years to come to be part of the solution?
I see we've got another question from Claire.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Claire. You can go ahead.
yeah, I can see Claire's question on the chat line, so we could deal with that there if we can't get to it. Should I respond? Hello?
Please, Anne.
Okay.
Claire, would you like to voice your question?
Anne can see it. She can go ahead. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, so let me start with, I mean, Craig is a big issue. They're obviously ideological, what you're calling cultural, they're ideological intonations. And I think there are expectations of the state that exist in South Africa. But the fact is the state has failed. Anybody who sees the article in the City Press on Sunday, where our metro rail system has been destroyed. The failure of security, it's a failure by PRASA. Look at the procurement situation, look at almost in every direction you want, not everything, but we're seeing a tremendous lack of capacity by a very weak state. And I think that is starting to change attitudes. So I don't think this is ideological. I think that there are many people in South Africa, me included, would like an effective professional state. And I would certainly support the right measures to get there, where you have merit appointments and you perhaps have an entrance exam and far less patronage. But we're not there. And South Africa needs action now. And I think one of the duties of leaders is to start being much more honest about this and, in a sense, start changing the culture that only a state has the interests of the people at heart. In fact, the last long period in South Africa has shown that not to be the case. So I think there is cultural and education required. From the man from the New Leaders Foundation, I think that's a really important question. What can individuals do? I think there are a range of things that all of us can do. if you're an entrepreneur, you could start a firm. You could take a risk on starting a firm and hiring as many people as possible. You can talk to your friends about the realities of South Africa and what needs to change. In many respects, the most effective way to change policies is for the present political incumbents to be worried that they might lose their seats in the next election. We have local elections coming up. Think hard. If you're in a small town or a secondary city, there are citizens starting to say, I'm not going to elect another bunch of crooks. It's time to try some new people. Let's find some citizens we trust who are going to take over leadership in the local government election. So I think that's another area one can talk about. I think there's lots that people can do, and it depends where you sit and what influence you have, but you can certainly start by talking to all your friends about what has to change in South Africa, and that if we carry on with the same old policies and attitudes, we are not going to get out of this multiple set of crises. Now, Claire's trying to sneak in a question she wanted me to write to her about, which is a long topic. CPE, for a long time, we have been arguing that perhaps one way to start changing our labor market, which is probably unique in the world in that so many young people don't have jobs, and what we have put forward is to have a special economic zone, possibly in the Eastern Cape, where we bring in, it's a zone of exception, if you like, special in that sense, where certain rules don't apply and where you can attract foreign investment, possibly domestic investment as well. And we start doing what has helped many countries in Asia to get out of, for millions of people to get out of poverty. Essentially, low skill factories with inevitably low wages initially that produce t-shirts or assemble toys or electronic goods for export. And that's how many, many women and men have moved out of poverty in China, in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, in Laos, Cambodia, in many places all over the world by coming to work in a factory, not fabulous work, but generally for 5 to 7 years. And then what happens is both the individual moves out, they've accumulated a bit of know-how and some money. They either can start their own little company or they go back to rural areas and they no longer under the thumb of their father, their brother, their husband. For women particularly, they can be independent. But the firm also moves up the kind of ladder and becomes a more sophisticated firm, creating more and more sophisticated jobs with better wages. So we're absolutely in favor of that. We wish that the government and the provincial government of the Eastern Cape would follow up on this proposal. And it's hard to know how big this could be. We think it could be a way of demonstrating that another approach is possible and that this could help South Africa get out of the very difficult situation that we're in. And it's one way of illustrating that South Africa has choices. We're certainly not saying we should undermine the rights of existing workers, and that this could be a way of starting to test a whole new approach. Are there other questions?
I see quite a few questions in the chat box. Would you like me to read some of those, or?
No, I'm happy to see them.
Many of them refer to education and what you mentioned about education, and if you believe that education can actually make a difference.
Yeah, let me talk about two things that have come up. The one is just following what I've said. Somebody's asked, are these sweatshops? Let's talk about that. This is a lot of people dismiss what we're saying and say you just want to exploit workers by asking them to work in sweatshops. And I think the big question South Africans have to wrestle with is, do you think it's better to have no job at all, or to start your journey of work in a low skill, low wage, but with basic health and safety standards? I am absolutely convinced that the worst possible option for people is what we're doing to them now. We're saying unemployment is better than a low skill job. Something you force people to do, it's a question of choice. If you look at the numbers, the very large numbers of people who are willing and eager to work in a public works job, which pays very little money, we know that there are lots of South Africans who would be willing, choose to work in a low-skill factory. And that's really what we're saying. I'm in favor of individual choice. But many people think what we want are high-paying jobs and we won't settle for anything else. But what they're effectively saying to people who don't have skills, who through no fault of their own went to a terrible school, often live in a household and a community where very few people work, they're saying to those people, you should rather not have a job than go and have a job in a factory where you all learn things. We all learned lots of things on our first job, and you can progress upwards. You don't just make, a part of a t-shirt forever. You can maybe one day make a men's shirt, much more complicated, or the shirt that I'm wearing. Or perhaps you can become a manager of other people starting at the bottom. So I don't accept the notion of sweatshops. I do think that you want to keep basic health and safety standards, but we're a living experiment of that attitude resulting in very few jobs at all. So that's the one point I want to make. The second is, there were some questions about education. I'm not quite sure what the question is. Let me just say that, in my view, South Africa should be looking at why we are one of the lowest performing education systems in the world, and what we have to change in order to improve. We have made some improvements, without doubt, but they're not nearly significant enough. We've got to move up at 1 or 2 levels, start competing with Kenya. Because at the moment we wallow at the bottom with very poor countries. And there are a lot of poor countries that do better than South Africa on all the international tests. So fixing the education system, vital. Fixing the skills and vocational education system should have been done yesterday. We spend a lot of money. It's not very effective. It's not linked to the world of work very effectively. And we really, really, really need to get much better at that. So that's the second thing in terms of education and skills.
And thank you very much for that. What I saw from the questions is the link between the not very qualitative, or the education that's of a low quality, and then low skilled jobs. So what the question, it seems to be, is how does this relate that our education level is not on the quality that's expected, and then actually then also giving not the skills that we need in the job market?
Well, the hard truth is that South Africa over the last, 50, 60 years has failed to build a qualified and skilled workforce. That's it. We failed. And the democratic government has certainly not changed that. It's hard. There's some people who say it's worse than it was under apartheid. I think that's very hard to. I think that is probably wrong. And there is no doubt that there have been small improvements, but these are insufficient. Not skilled come into the workplace, which is increasingly looking for people who understand technology and who it requires more and more skills and network building from people, you're at an immediate disadvantage. So South Africa has to accept we have to have an economy that creates jobs for the workforce we actually have and not the highly skilled one we wish we had. I wish we had that, but we don't. So we need to do two things. We need to create the work and we need to work extremely hard, day and night, to fix our schooling system and our vocational education and skills system. And that's what we're not doing. So that's a big priority, but I think we've got to really get the economy growing much faster and quickly, and we have to get much more labor-intensive activities going now.
After Lita Brian's up, Brian's color.
All right, can we?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
And my question to you relates to how to change the attitude. You have spoken about it, but how to change the attitude of getting people to start their first job. There's been some excellent work done by Esther Duflo, who got the Nobel Prize last year, on the situation in India, where her research revealed that many people were unemployed because they were waiting for a job that they couldn't get. They were reasonably well educated and they thought they should be able to command a suitable high-paying job. And they found that there were two factors which contributed to why they were prepared to stick around and wait until the ideal job came up. The two factors were, one, if the family was receiving social grants, there was a reason for them to stick around with the family and not get out to work. And the second factor, which was that government jobs in India are highly paid, way above the private sector. Now, it seems to me that these problems also have their parallel in South Africa. Your comments, please.
Yes.
There's
So
also Kain, before you respond, and there's also Kain Scott. Let's allow him to talk.
Thank you, and thank you for the wonderful presentation. So I guess one of the things that's occurred to me during your presentation is the extent to which we're speaking here about government's influence on unemployment, and that certainly is something we should hold in tension. But I guess part of what I'm wondering is the extent to which unemployment in South Africa is a problem that's perpetuated by the private sector, and also by conditions which both the government and the private sector are struggling to work under. So for example, a low trust environment where people struggle to trade their goods and services, lack of access to markets, a very small population that has disposable income. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, what are the conditions that I think affect both government and the private sector in perpetuating the high unemployment rate? And I guess, have we seen positive movements in the past 20 years, for example? Like when I look at the period from 2003 to 2011, there were more, the South African economy looked in a much better state than it looks today. And I wonder if there are particular changes that you would notice being responsible for that.
okay, great. Let me answer these two because we're starting to run out of time. I think one always has to be very careful about taking international experience and thinking and, saying, oh, this must apply in South Africa as well. I think the best research, and there isn't tons and tons, but the best research on the social grant to help people with children and so on, is that this money is used productively. It's used to help people eat better. It's used to help people pay for transport to go and get a job interview if there were jobs being available. And so I think one needs to be careful.
Letters to say for follow up with Anne.
He's talking. I think one has to be very careful if you say if we give people some money, this will inevitably make them less reluctant to get a job. You need to prove that empirically. And it might be the case for a few people, but really we give people so little. It would certainly be the case if you went for a basic income grant at a high level. You would start paying people more than what local employers are offering, and this would be very problematic. So that's a bigger discussion. So I think that's the first thing I would say. The second is, I'm trying to remember the second point, Brian. Your second question?
That people were waiting for a high-paid job in government, and government wages were much higher than the private sector in India.
Yes, well, South Africa's gone through a big phase, the last decade really, where public sector wages were growing at a much faster rate than private sector wages. This will stop. This cannot go on. And you can't have 1.3 million people eating up an enormous amount of our tax revenue. So I think this phenomenon is going to stop. It's been negative in all sorts of ways. And you are going to find that people, I think leaders also have a role here in terms of informing citizens of the odds of them getting a public sector job are very low, and they have to look elsewhere. So there needs to be much greater realism, but the phenomenon of the public sector wages just growing phenomenally has, I think, come to an end. So that situation is going to change quite a lot. In terms of Karen's question about what are the factors that are making it so hard to get growth going in South Africa now, and how have things changed in the last, from the first years of democracy to now? Well, we all know, I think two things have changed really. The one is the quality of state understanding, regulation, and interaction with market players has got worse. It wasn't great to begin with, it's got worse in the last 12 years. I think that the enormous corruption in the state, facilitated, encouraged, participated in by certain elements in business, has been a big factor in undermining trust in our society. Literally, the state has looted public coffers, and this must make citizens very cautious about engaging with the state. There are many issues that are affecting why South Africa is struggling to grow, from the size of our debt and the perception that there isn't a steady hand on the tiller. So why invest in this country? There are big risks involved. There's a lack of clarity about policy in terms of property rights, a very big issue. We're also, the world economy is in a different place. So I think South Africa muddled along in the first 15 years till about 2009. It could have a bit of socialism, a bit of capitalism, and we kind of made progress. But the increasing emphasis on state-driven development, exacerbated then by wholesale capture by the president and the Guptas and others, and then widespread corruption throughout the system. All of this has undermined the environment for growth. We're also a heavily regulated economy, which makes it harder for small businesses to start, for small businesses to survive, for other companies to expand. So there are a welter of issues that before we come to the harder kind of issues, there are a lot of policy issues that you could fix. We could be fixing the regulatory environment much more quickly than we are. We could be fixing a whole lot of things much more quickly, but we're not doing that. So I think this is a big topic to understand why we're in such a declining economic environment now, pre-COVID, never mind the quality of the decision-making about the economy during the intense period of the lockdown.
And thank you very much for that. One last question, and I think that what we can't understand is the delay in opening up the economy at this stage with COVID as it is. And obviously the president, the government, and we see the Treasury realize the damage that's being done by keeping the economy closed. Do you have any insights? What's happening? When are we opening up?
Well, I have no insights, but my newspapers tell me that it's very likely the president's going to make some announcements tonight. So I'm in favor of opening up as fast as we possibly can. And I think he's going to remove some of the remaining restrictions this evening if the reports are true, but it's within the next few days. So
yeah, we really hold thumbs that will be the case, because the economic outlook is really concerning at this stage. And do you have time for any more questions?
Not really. I have to go to another meeting, I'm afraid. Thanks very much for the opportunity. Please look at our website, everybody, if you don't know it already. And it's been a great discussion. Thank you very much.
And it was lovely having you. As I say, it's wonderful to hear the honesty with which you address these problems. And we really hope that somebody is listening to what you're saying. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.